Hello and welcome back to Vox Terra. Today I want to start with a headline from Democracy Now! California Governor Gavin Newsom signs bill protecting farm workers' union rights, September 29 of 2022. And notably from that article, before I begin my commentary, last month Newsom had threatened to veto the bill known as AB 2183, but reversed his opposition after President Joe Biden and other top Democrats spoke in favor of it. That followed a long grassroots campaign waged by thousands of farm workers and their allies, who in August marched over 300 miles to California's state capital in Sacramento to demand protection for union supporters. Teresa Romero, United Farm Workers president, quoted as saying, "This is an incredible victory. Starting next year, farm workers can participate in elections free from intimidation and deportations." Now, that last quote about free from intimidation and deportations is really something to reflect upon, as is the political dynamics of this. So thing number one to keep in mind, as I've mentioned to you before and cited to the League of Conservation Voters, Democrats, while yes, getting money from large corporations as Republicans do, tend to be more responsive to environmental organizations. Overall, getting less money, far less in the case of fossil fuels than Republicans do. But similarly, Democrats are far more responsive to the labor unions. So in this case, we saw a struggle within the Democratic Party, but eventually Gavin Newsom gave in and supported the workers, the labor union. Now, this concerns our environment because the labor unions are not only about the wages, but they also often tend to be about the safety and working conditions. So in the case of farm workers, a lot of them are getting exposed to a lot of pesticides and herbicides. Well, that type of farming really benefits no one. But now let's look at this idea about what the president of the United Farm Workers said about deportations and intimidation. Well, what I'm thinking she's talking about here is based on what I've heard from other interviews, is when farm workers complain who do not have legal status in the United States, they're going to get threatened with deportation and maybe will get reported on and deported. Well, what about other types of intimidation? A lot of us, if we've driven through the country or gone to the countryside, we might often see Confederate flags, or maybe nowadays more popular would be an FUCK Joe Biden or a Let's Go Brandon, which have a similar vibe to the Confederate flags. And I would think that a lot of migrant farm workers tending to be of Latin American descent might feel somewhat intimidated or put off by Confederate flags and FU Biden flags. So here we want to think about, did we ever really have cheap food in the United States? Now, I know now with inflation that situation has changed recently, but when we call it cheap, at what cost was it really coming at? Or is it still coming at? To what degree do we think about a labor force who somehow people look the other way when they're here illegally if they are keeping quiet, but then once they start to complain about their circumstance, I'm not getting paid, well, you're going to get deported then. What does that say about the condition those workers are under and the intimidation they might feel by other residents living near the farms? In your imagination, do you draw any analogy to the old slave days? But now think too about those pesticides and herbicides I mentioned, and also combine it with genetically modified food sources. Well, those genetically modified foods are often genetically modified not as they're promoted to make it like more efficient or something better, climate resistant, but to resist herbicides so that farming can be done in a way that's really depleting the soil and pumping that soil and air and the food itself full of toxic carcinogenic chemicals. Now, as far as I'm aware, a lot of the feedstock chemical or the feedstock source for these synthetic pesticides and such come from fossil fuels, I believe, and definitely the shipping. Well, our agricultural system is heavily based on these mass farms and shipped all over the planet and all over the nation. Well, what is that doing to the environment? And what's the cost of that not being factored in? So when we add up low-paid labor, who often feels intimidated, pesticides, herbicides, which have a carcinogenic effect, other health effects, neurotoxins, greenhouse gases, all those costs, well, this food was never really cheap. And we should think too about, it isn't just farm workers in the US who seem to be low paid. This appears to be a worldwide phenomena. So if these factors were considered in the price, then the food sources that we have to pay a lot of money for now, organic, more ethically raised, would suddenly become cheaper by comparison. Same for local. What would a climate smart, healthy, environmentally sustainable food system look like? I believe it would look local, largely organic, incorporating practices like agroforestry, where you're growing your crops among trees, and even encouraging more home growing of foods. Well, hey, I hope you found this interesting, insightful, helpful, useful, entertaining. And if so, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. You've clicked that notification bell. You're commenting sincere constructive criticism. Welcome. Supportive comments, liking, donating a Patreon. Thank you, Bella Grissin, Environmental Coffee House. And until next time, and as always, peace be with you.